So a little history on me. Dennis, he was our pastor up in Price for a few years, and we got to be friends. And he said, you were without a pastor for a week. Would I like to come? And it's like, well, you bet. We'd really be glad to. A little more about me. So I grew up in Colorado. I loved science and eventually went to school, Colorado State, and got a master's degree and did some other things. But eventually I'll get to some of this too later, but I taught for a couple years, actually about 10 years in Wichita, Kansas, at the academy there. I was a junior academy. And then as my kids got older and older, they wanted to go somewhere new, and I went to Days Creek, Oregon, and I taught out there for a few years at Milo Academy. After that, we chased our kids back and forth, and eventually I went to Kansas, and I taught for a year or two at the academy there, and then the academy closed. And after that, I went back into the world of science, and I worked at Kansas Department of Health for about 5 years as a groundwater geologist, and then tried to chase my family again and got as far west as Price, Utah. And so that's where I'm at now, and I work at the Bureau of Land Management. I'm the field manager at the moment, but the first part of the career there was I was their geologist. And as you'll see in a few minutes, the area around where I'm at is full of coal mines, and the geology is fantastic. So that's actually why I went. I had done some of my undergraduate work at one time in and around there, and it's like, oh, this is so good. So I had a couple choices. I could have gone to Salt Lake, and it's like, oh, don't want to do that. So I went to Price, Utah. So that's a little bit about me. I'd like to actually talk a little bit about my wife. And I hope you can see, because most of this presentation is going to be up on the screen. So my wife is Evelyn. I want you to know that she is awesome. And not just because I say so. She is really amazing. If I had to brag about all of her best qualities, the first one would be she grew up on a farm, a ranch, and she can outwork almost any of you. I know she can outwork me every day of the week. She just never stops. She's a dynamo. And she quilts. In a minute, you'll see one of her quilts. Anyway, that's her right there. And those are our two grandkids. We actually have 4 now. Just this last year, we had 2 new ones. So I got 2 from my son, and I got 2 from my daughter, and it's perfect. Although I really wanted 2 boys and 2 girls. I've got 3 boys and 1 girl, but at least I've got that 1 girl, and I'm pretty excited about that. There she is there, and you'll notice, I know you can see the kids have goggles, they're already scientists. And this is just outside my office, a little place called The Wedge. And there's Ev taking pictures of her favorite people in the world. And that's one of her quilts. And I love bragging about her, and I love bragging about the things that she does. And here's the rest of my family. The itty-bitty little babies are there, one just hiding under the blanket, and they're my 2 grandsons, and my lovely wife is over on the left, hiding herself with that wool hat. Anyway, I love bragging about her, and you know what? I really think that's what Paul was doing in Romans 1:16. So what I'd like to do, I don't know if you guys do this much at all, but I would like to read the black, and if you'd read the red, that would be good. That kind of keeps you involved, and you know where I'm going. So it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ." The gospel. "For in it the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. You think about it, now I know I'm proud of my wife and family, but Paul was proud of his God. And in this case, he's talking about the good news, the gospel. There's probably other ways we could say this as a Christian. Just like that song, how great is our God. How fantastic is our God. And I can think of Paul wanting to tell the Romans in pen, because he wasn't there yet, he wanted to tell them how great is our God. And it's interesting to me that as soon as he gets done saying this, in the next part of his book, now that's awful little on the print. I don't know if you can read it. Can you read it? Close? Okay. So, as he extols God's greatness, then he seems to turn to this strange topic called wrath. And actually, I think it's important because this is probably where he wanted to clarify something about how good God really is. Like he's not vindictive, he's not all those bad things you've ever heard. This is what we mean by his wrath. And it goes like this. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who, by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, for since the creation of the world, there you go, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, having been understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. Therefore, God gave them over. In their sinful desires, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a ignorant mind. Although they knew God's righteous decree that those that do such things deserve death, they not only continued to do these very things, but they also approved of those that practiced them. The wrath of God. It sounds so formidable. And yet, when we think about what this wrath really is him abandoning them. And it's a sad thing when we get abandoned because it's not pretty, right? When God's wrath was poured out on King Saul, you'll remember that he fought the Philistines and God abandoned him and he was shot with an arrow and died. When God's wrath was poured out on the 10 tribes of Israel, he abandoned them, and the Assyrians destroyed Israel. Later, about 100 years later, in 586, when God's wrath was poured out on the tribes of Judah, they were conquered by Babylon. He abandoned them for 70 years, right? When God abandoned Jesus on the cross, Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? God left him, and he died, right? Paul goes on to talk about it a little bit in Romans 4:25, and he says he was delivered over because of our wrongdoings and was raised because of our justification. He was made to be sin, though he knew no sin. And we know what happened. Finally, after he died, and a few years later after they stoned Stephen, again, what could God do for these people that had abandoned him? In AD 70, In AD 70, Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome. It was a horrible plunder. 1 million Jews were destroyed, but they had abandoned their only hope. They had given up Christ. And before Jesus left, you'll remember as he was looking at the temple, his disciples said, "Oh, look at the beautiful white temple, how great it is." And Jesus cried on the cross, or cried there looking down over the city. And he said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who sent her, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you were not willing. See,
your house is left to you desolate."
the house was left desolate. You'll remember in Ezekiel, the light that was in the temple left. It was a prophecy of God abandoning Israel. And he did. It was just really sad. I know in the book Great Controversy it says about this story, when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, God poured out his wrath on Jerusalem. He withdrew his protection and removed the restraints that held back Satan. It's a horrible thing to experience God's wrath in that he stops protecting. It's really horrible. And I work with a bunch of scientists. I live in a world of scientists now. And I fear in talking to them, some of them are hardcore atheists, and they'll argue till they're blue in the face about how wrong I am as a Christian. And I fear that someday, if not already, God will abandon them, and it'll be a bad day for them. What I want to do today, 3 things. First one I already did. I want to talk about actually the good news. I think God is so awesome, and one of the awesome things about him is he protects us and he loves us as long as we are willing. Amen. And then second, the next thing I want to bring up is a little bit about Darwin and evolution. Again, I work with scientists all the time who believe to the soul of their boot that Darwin was right. And it's not that he's 100% right. There is some change. I believe there's some change today. We have more blue eyes than we used to as a population. Little changes. But what Darwin did in a big way has really been a blight to this planet. It has made more skeptics and more infidels than almost anything I can think of. And then third, and most of the rest of this, I want to show you why, as a Christian, as a geologist, I still believe in God. I still believe in the Bible. And I'm glad I could be here to share that with you today. One of the reasons I'm a Christian today is I read the Bible. When I talk to my evolutionary friends, they've never read it. They've heard it, and they mock it, but they've never read it. And one of the things I said is like, as a scientist, aren't you supposed to compare all the evidence? Well, then read the book. I'm really glad that before I was confronted with tough choices in college, that I had read the book. And later on, I'd read Ellen White. And both of those things, to me, testify that there's nothing else as amazing as those books. There is no literature, there's no peer to either. Anyway, here's Ellen White and James White. There's Darwin on the right. When Ellen White wrote the book Great Controversy, she was in Australia, and this is her home in Australia. And then here's the HMS Beagle. This was his ship. To me, it's interesting, it's ironic maybe, or providential, that Ellen White wrote her book about the same year that Darwin wrote his. About the same year. I don't think they ever met. He was usually in Europe, and at this point in time, she was down in Australia. But way back then, 1858, 1859, 2 philosophies hit the world in those books. I'd like to tell you a little bit about me and again, why I'm more of a Christian than some of my colleagues maybe. When I went to college, I went to Colorado State University, and my first class was psychology. And the first 2 months of the semester, it seems like, they tried to drill into me that God was dead, that religion was opium for the masses. And it's like, are you kidding? I mean, I knew I couldn't convince them or prove that God existed. And I also knew that they probably couldn't prove God didn't. But I couldn't believe that they tried so hard to do that. I was just really shocked. And as you know, and maybe in your own college, anybody else had a philosophy class, or did they try and do the same thing? Unless you went to a Christian school. Anyway, I did that, and I endured it. And then I had like 3 more years of evolution this and evolution that in my biology classes and in my geology classes. But then I had a class from this guy. Actually, I had several. This man's name's Dr. Johnson. He was a legend at the university. He was the dean of the department. He was amazing. And everybody loved taking his classes. He taught paleontology, and he taught structural classes as well. Anyway, you can see he was University at Syracuse, a professor in Illinois. He was a professor at Purdue, eventually Colorado State. He worked for the geophysicist he was a geophysicist at the Bureau of Reclamation. He worked at USGS. Like I said, he was a legend. And at the end of my last class, paleontology, we'd already done our final, and I passed. And he said, there's one more lecture. And it was at night instead of the day. And we all went. In fact, the place was packed. It probably held 300 people, and I don't think there was a spare seat. And he told us a little bit about himself, you know, where he got his degrees, where he did his research. And let me show you a little bit of the research. So he did paleontology, and so here's some brachiopods. And you'll notice the brachiopods have symmetry down the center as opposed to some other shells that I'll show you. But this was where his research was just in fossils. Those are brachiopods. There's some other ones. And again, you can see kind of the wing fashion. They're symmetrical around the vertical axis there. In this lecture, he told us about the painful research that he did, and that he would line up all of the brachiopods, and then here's some more brachiopods. And they're called plesiopods, or just clams. But notice the symmetry is a little different. Instead of being symmetrical down the center, you have to turn them sideways, and then they're symmetrical. But they're kind of the same little animal. They eat the same. They look the same. They still have the same aragonite shells, etc. But most evolutionary people would say the brachiopods turned into these clams and plesiopods. And then there's trilobites, and eventually somehow you have to get trilobites out of these. And then there's another animal that kind of looks like a plant. They're called blastoids. And here's one where I have kind of everything together. So we've got coral, we've got the brachiopods, we have ammonites, blastoids, and other things. But anyway, as he showed through that lecture, he demonstrated that even though things change a little bit, even though your brachiopods get a little bit bigger or they grow a few more spines, he never ever saw a brachiopod turn into a plesiopod. There was never a missing link. And he did this with all the fossils that we'd studied all semester. It was really spectacular. Anyway, for me as a budding Christian, and I hadn't graduated, I hadn't gone to an Adventist anything yet. In fact, I didn't know about Adventists yet. And he really inspired me. It's like this man really bucked the system, because you know all the other geologists made fun of him at the universities. But he was beyond reproach. He was just an awesome guy. By the way, they used to think that brachiopods were extinct. They're not. If you go to some of the deeper places in the ocean and the mid-ocean rifts, the hot spots, there's still some in here, some. Anyway, I didn't realize it. He passed away. And I looked up his name not too long ago, and I noticed this. This was in the newspaper about when he died. And at the end it says, together Garnett, that's his wife, and Bob reached their academic goals. She was a PhD as well. And continued an exciting life in a variety of places and activities, always sharing the same faith and enjoying God's amazing earth. And in its beauty through traveling and camping. And he did. He traveled all over. I didn't know at the time, and he didn't say so at that lecture, but he was a Sunday school teacher. Pretty awesome. Pretty awesome. Anyway, that's one reason why I'm a Christian today. I had, in this case, I think, a very good mentor. More reasons to be a Christian. You know what? There's a lot of old scientists that were Christians. Over on the left, there's Johannes Kepler. And then just down catty corner, you can see Galileo. You remember they were contemporaries. Kepler was a Lutheran, so he was a Protestant. Galileo was Catholic at the time, and if you know the story, Galileo was told to recant by the Pope, and he was told he was going to be excommunicated and all these other things. He almost did. But the reason the Pope wanted him to recant is because Galileo was using this Protestant's book to prove that the earth was going around the sun and not the other way around. We have Louis Pasteur. Up in the top right, we've got Newton. Of course, we've got Einstein. And then we have over here Boyle. All of those are great scientists from the 1800s, actually earlier than that too. Here's some more. You'll remember Mr. Washington on the left, peanuts and all the other hundreds of things that he did. He was really a great scientist. We have Mendel right in the middle, and then there's Einstein again, but that's with Planck. Planck was a Christian. Interesting that both Einstein and Planck back in the 1930s, 1940s were debating these big things in physics. Both of them believed in God, so I think that's exciting. If Einstein can believe in God, I think that's okay for a lot of my colleagues too. We have Maxwell in the middle, down at the bottom. He did a lot with thermodynamics. And then we have a guy named Nicholas Steno, who was an early geologist over on the right. Now, those are old folks. Those are back in the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s. What about today? Are there some great scientists today that believe in God? And here's one. This is a philosopher. His name's Antony Flew. Antony Flew is one of those people you would never want to meet. He was against religion. All of his life, he was an atheist until about 2004. He changed his mind, and all of his peers are thinking, what happened to him? He's lost his mind. And he wrote a book. Let me read you a little bit about it. Let's see, he criticized the idea of life after death and free will, the meaningfulness of God, etc. In fact, he was one of the signatories of the Humanist Manifesto. Anybody know what that is? You ought to look it up. It is horrible. I mean, the things that they actually adhere to, there's like 15 premises that they believe in. One was they want to get rid of religion. But there's more to it. You ought to look it up. Anyway, so he, in 2004, changed his position and stated that he now believed in the existence of an intelligent creator of the universe, shocking colleagues and fellow atheists. He stated that in keeping his lifelong commitment to go where the evidence leads, he now believed in the existence of God. And here's the book. I ordered it a few weeks ago, and I kept thinking, oh, it's got to come, so I could show it to you, but it didn't come in time. So I give it a try. So the guy on the left, this guy is Francis Collins. You might know him from the Genesis Project, the Human Genome Project. He was the director of this entire program. A few years ago, in actually 2020, he was the winner of the Templeton Prize, which actually you get more money than the Nobel Prize, which was really big. He stated, "It's humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we have caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book, previously known only to God." That was his statement when the genome that they had traced out was published. He also said, "The God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. He can be worshipped in the cathedral or the laboratory." So I thought that was good too. The guy on the right is Marcelo Glicer. He reigns most of the time down in Mexico. However, he worked for a long time at the Fermi Lab, and now he works at the Cavelli Institute for Theoretical Physics, and that's in Santa Barbara, one of the big name places in the nation. He received the Templeton Prize for his works in physics and philosophy, and his key word is this: the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I think that's a good one too to tell your colleagues. I'd like to, because I'm a geologist, share a few things with you about where I live in the Price area and the geology that we all see. Is this familiar to you? You've seen a geologic column like this? Yes? Okay. So this is kind of generic. The blue at the bottom, you have the Cambrian, which is supposed to be the beginning of life, which is really the beginning of death. And then as it kind of crawls up, you've got these others, Silurian, Devonian, again, eventually the Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. The green area is where all the dinosaurs are and die. And there's lots of those around. Are there dinosaurs around here? You have those? Okay. Up where I live, there's plenty too. What I want to do on this, without spending too much time or getting too technical, is talk about, well, first off, all of these are sediments, so they've all been put down by wind or water. And also what I'd like to have you notice is that you're going to see about 2 different flood sequences. Now, think about it. Remember, in Genesis it says that that the Holy Spirit was hovering over the deep, hovering over the water. Well, there was water. When God made this planet and Adam and Eve and everything else was on it, there was water. There may not have been massive oceans, but there were oceans. There were water all over the planet. And where you have water, you're going to have sediments. And after sin happened, Adam and Eve sinned, death came to our planet. That's actually happened a long time before the flood. And what I'd like to do is point out that those blue layers right there, the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, those have just itty-bitty little fossils. They have your brachiopods, like we pointed out, some shells, some worms, and some other things that we would say were the lower type life. In the Genesis world that God made with Adam and Eve, there were little critters, and then after sin, they started dying. And sediments came into the oceans, and they buried them and buried them. But in those blue areas down there, you don't find any big dinosaurs. You don't find your big fossils. And it seems logical to me that that's the way it happened until the flood. And then we have the areas above it, the green, and the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. If you look at the deposits, and I'll show you a couple here in a minute, those deposits are natural disasters. There's flash floods. In fact, I'll show you one. There's the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry, now the Jurassic Monument. where that's how the Morrison and others were produced. But those were your beginning stages, if you will, of the flood. And then things are blown in from different places, and eventually it's going to fill up with water, and I'll show you that. So those are the formations, and I know you're probably too far away and can't see it, so we'll skip it. What I want you to do is look at this diagram. Let's see. I'm told this has the red button? Okay, it won't work. All right, you'll just have to look close. Notice the water, you deep sea, continental slope. You've got a little delta to the left, then you got beach, and then there's a continental shelf, and then you've got this tidal flat. And then inland, you've got a desert and rivers and lakes and that kind of stuff. Notice that they're all pretty close to together. If you just go a little further north, you can go from the delta to the beach. If you go a little further north, you go beach to the continental shelf, which is going to be more sediment deposits. And that's the way we see them in the rock record. These layers will kind of interfinger and intermingle, but they are right next to each other. And so as the water gets deeper or as it recedes, we get these environments that go lay on top of each other, and it's just natural. That's the way it should happen. So in and around Price, we have this big anticline called the San Rafael Swell. It's got some really cool things to it, but what I want to point out is it's a big dome, and so some of the rocks kind of crop up on the edges, and you get to see them, which is kind of nice. They're not hidden. So if you go to Kansas, you can't see any of the rocks because they're all buried. But in Utah, they're sticking up, and there's no trees and no soil, nothing to cover them up. And so it's kind of a nice place to go look. So here's the San Rafael Swell. And over on the right, kind of the kind of brown, smooth, round part, those are the sediments that are a little lower down, the Permian, the blue. And then on the sides here, you start to see the Navajo Formation, and then you've got the Carmel. And then, is Carmel here? All right, Carmel's here, good deal. And then we have some others, the Morrison, and then the Mancos, and we'll show you some pictures there. This is the road that you come in. What you're looking at there is actually the sequence. You got the Navajo on the top, and you're looking at the middle part, which is the Wingate, and then down below we have the Chinle. Anyway, this is just giving you a picture of the cross-section. From that picture that you saw my wife taking the picture, here are the formations that you can see from that vantage point. And we'll just skip it. There we go. When you're in the Morrison Formation, that's the one that the Jurassic Monument is now. This is the bone bed. It's in a building. The building is going to be replaced with a bigger building. But since like the 1920s or thereabouts, they've been digging out bones. In fact, there's about 12,000 bones that have been removed. Somewhere around 70 Allosauruses or parts of Allosauruses have been pulled out. And it's just an interesting deposit. Now, they like to tell you that there's this mystery out there, that it could be this, it could be that, and it could be another thing. Some of them like to think that it's a mud pit and some other stuff. It's like, sorry, they're really wrong. And I don't have a PhD, but I think it was easy. There was a big flash flood, took these critters out, swept them up, and flushed them down into a delta. They ended up circling around in an eddy. They bloated. So that's why some of why they're all together. And then eventually, as they sunk into the mud, they came to this location. It had volcanic ash. There's lots of sand and silt and things from all over. But not just here, but also there's, let's see, there's the dinosaur, there's the big wall up in Vernal, another big deposit. Same type of thing, and you just have these critters who were all swept up. In fact, the whole Morrison is flash flood, flash flood, flash flood, all coming into some type of bay, or it's called maybe not an estuary, but some calm water where they were able to sink and then solidify. That's one of the Allosauruses. Like I said, there's about 70 of them. This is what they've done recently. It wasn't a monument before. It was okay, but somebody made it a monument, so then you have to pour millions of dollars into it so people like to go. And this is one of the things that they've just put in. Those are not real. That's concrete. But anyway, that's an Allosaurus that's been laid down, and now people can play on it. So if you want to go, this is what you get to see. Here's another thing, cute little girl. That's Dana. You remember Dana? And there's the Allosaurus head that they're playing on. But anyway, it's a neat place. It's the Morrison Formation. And then above the Morrison Formation, we have the, well, a little bit above the Morrison, is the Manco Shale. And down at the bottom, you can see the gray as it swoops on up. By the way, that's called Mount Elliott, and that elevation difference is about 2,000 feet, just to give you an idea. The Manco Shale is about 3,000 feet thick. It's a lot of clay and shale. And as it comes up, you can imagine being in the ocean, lots of mud, but if you're going to walk towards land, eventually you're going to come up to a delta. And as you get to the delta, you're going to have a little clay, but you're going to have some sand. And then you're going to have some clay, and then you're going to have some sand. And then you get further and further, you're going to have beach sands, and then the water's going to come up again, and you're going to have some shale. And that's what you're seeing right there. So you've got the Manco Shale on the bottom, and then those white layers are the sandstones. One's called the Star Point sandstone. Those are old beach sands. And then as the water raised up and went down, up and down, you can see how it alternated. Just above that, and just think, if you just had a monster flood and there was wood all over, what would you end up having? Yeah, so those are a couple of the coal seams that are just above it. They don't look like much from that picture, but they're about 20 feet thick, pretty big. Oh, there's one of the openings, and that's some of my colleagues. That's one of the coal seams. That's one of the coal mines, mine entering. What I wanted to show here is, see, on the right, can you see all the yellow? Those are all the coal beds in Utah. They're all at the same layer, all at the same level, and all of those had to have monstrous deposits of wood, which eventually got buried and turned into coal. This is one of the coal seams in Wyoming. This one is only about 100 feet. Some of them are 250 feet thick. And it takes about 10 feet of wood to make 1 foot of coal. That's how much it's compressed. And it's true that with all the weight, they can kind of squeeze together like toothpaste into bigger deposits. And that might explain some of it. But still, that is a lot of wood. How do you, one of the things that geologists and other people like to bring up is the present is the key to the past. Well, I'll tell you what, where do you see 100 feet or 200 feet, or if we need 10 times, and that's 100 feet thick, we need 1,000-foot deposit of wood and leaves and pollen and trash laying around somewhere getting buried. Do you see that anywhere on the planet? No. They say that the present is the key to the past, and that's not true. Not true. There's no modern analog for a deposit like this. And this isn't the biggest. There's some bigger than that. Those are the coal deposits in the United States, all of them about the same time. Above those coal deposits, imagine walking inland. What do you have inland from a beach? Back shore, you're going to have rivers, and they're going to be depositing stuff, and that's this Price River deposit. And then above that, if you keep going up, the next set of cliffs, we have, those are called the Beckwith Cliffs. And those are, I mean, they have mammoths in their fossils. They have modern streams, modern lakes, things that you would find a long way away, but still water deposited, sediments that really came from one big monster sequence of a flood. Now I'm looking at the clock, and I'm wondering how much time you guys allow for. We okay? Okay. So one of the other things I think is important is radioactive dating. Some of it's okay, most of it's not, and it's because, again, that fallacy, the present is supposed to be the key to the past, but if you don't know what the past was like, how can we say with certainty that's what it is? Well, with radioactive dating, they assume that carbon, I'm going to skip some of this. They assume that carbon-12 and carbon-14 were the same a long time ago. And that's not necessarily true. We have no way of telling what it might be. So have you worked with those death curves for radioactive dating? You know what a half-life is? Okay. They assume that red line. That red line says that you have a certain amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere at any given time. It's really small. It's only like 3 particles out of 2 trillion. So it's very small. But they're able to detect it, and we're really good at that, and the math is really great. It looks really easy, and the half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,730 years, right? But they assume this red line. And that, from a Christian standpoint, that's not necessarily the way it works. When God made everything, was there anything decaying? I don't think so. And so if nothing was decaying 6,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, wherever you want to put that line, if it wasn't decaying, then the amount of carbon-14 was 0. And that's this blue line down at the bottom. So imagine if you had to determine the age of something that started at creation, and you would trace that line over, it would look almost infinitely old. When it wasn't infinitely old, it's because there was no carbon-14 to decay. And so, fortunately, this graph came from Creation Institute, an awesome institution. I wanted to work there, but they wouldn't take me. You had to have a PhD. I didn't have a PhD, but I wanted to. Anyway, they made this graph, and they've been really great. I did take a class or 2 from them a long time ago. Anyway, carbon dating is flawed because of this premise that the present is the key to the past. And if the past changed, we can't tell. A couple other things as a geologist I found. Everybody been to Yellowstone? Yep. One of the cool things there is a place called Specimen Ridge. And if you go, you see all these petrified trees. Some of them are opalized, and so you get to see some blue quartz and maybe a little red quartz, but it's really kind of neat. When I was in college back in 1980, a long time ago, my book told me that sequence, and there was like 20 or 30, actually somebody counted, there's like 60 layers where it looked like a forest grew and a forest was buried. And a forest grew and a forest was buried. And they told me back then it was like 50 to 100,000 years. And then what happened in 1980 that you know of that happened in Washington State? Mount St. Helens blew, didn't it? And so this is Spirit Lake. This is before it blew. And over on the left, this is Spirit Lake after it blew, and you get to see those trees that are dangling. And over on the right, I took that from a book. That's the one from Specimen Ridge. And you get to see the trees. The trees are standing up. You would think that if a tree is dead, it would lay over, but they don't, because the ball of the tree, the root ball, is so heavy, it still sits vertically. And then with all the ash and all the stuff that comes in afterwards, it gets buried. And they seem to think that this happened over and over and over. Mount St. Helens said it took a day to do that. Pretty awesome. Anyway, if the top right, you get to see one of the trees that pokes through those layers. This is Spirit Lake after the explosion. That used to be all forest. And you can see it's no longer forest, denuded. And if you go back there now, it's back to a forest. In fact, when that happened, some of the scientists didn't think it would come back for 1,000 years. And it took just a few years to start repopulating, and it looks pretty good. Okay, some other reasons why I really believe in what we believe. I work with archaeologists. And I was at a convention just a few weeks ago at the museum, and they had 50 or 60 archaeologists around, and I asked one, said, what do you do with dates? He said, oh, in fact, he was shocked I asked, and then he was disgusted. You could see the look on his face, and he said, we ignore it. He says he had a few words that weren't very good, very colorful, about how bad it was. He said, we don't use them. I said, well, how come it says so in all these books? And it's like, well, they get money. And if the date works for the philosophy that's behind the book, that's what they do. It's like, all right, I get it. My archaeologists, I have 2 or 3 on my staff, and the same thing, you talk to them, and it's like, well, we don't use them here, not in Utah. These dates are all messed up. But there is some archaeology that's good. I'll skip that and that. That happens to be the hunt panel near where I live. One of the things they like to do to test something, in this case, somebody took and chipped off all the patina. And so you've got these neat animals, these, I'll just leave it at that, critters. What they do to determine the date is to go ahead and chip something nearby and then see how long it takes for the color to come back, for the staining to come back. And then they calculate that back, for thousands of years. Thing is, the present is not the key to the past. These sediments used to have a lot of water in them. Once they eroded, the water came out with all of the minerals and left this beautiful staining, but it happened fast, and now the water's gone, and it's not replenishing itself. And so if they take what happens today as the way to date something, they're going to be wrong. And they're beginning to know that it's not working out. One of the other reasons that I am excited about some archaeology is some archaeology really proves what we believe in the Bible. Now, I don't know if this is called the Ivory Pomegranate. Any pastors here? Have you studied the Ivory Pomegranate? So this cropped up not too long ago. There's a big debate over whether it's real or not. And I know I wish I knew the ancient languages, but I don't. But it says something about belonging to the temple of Yahweh. And the backside is broken off, and some people think that somebody later on etched a couple things into it to make it look older than it is. Now, if you know anything about the first temple, or second temple, Solomon's temple, they had the priests, and they had the pomegranates and the whole garb. We do not have any archaeological evidence that Solomon's temple ever existed. So what you have Jerusalem, you have the mosque on top, and so you can't dig under it. But there's the other place they've dug down and they've been able to find a lot of things, but they need to keep going. They haven't dug it up yet. But there's not much, if any, evidence of Solomon's temple. This is evidence of Solomon's temple. Anyway, if you are an archaeologist that does not believe in the Bible, you're going to do everything you can to say this is a hoax. But if you're an archaeologist that already believes in the Bible, you're going to say this is the real McCoy. And actually, that's kind of where it's being debated right now. Evidence that the Solomon's temple really existed. Really exciting. So this is an ossuary. And it says, let's see, I want to get it right. This is James, the son of Joseph. And that part's actually everybody has looked at it. Both skeptics and believers have looked at it and said, that is what it says. But some think that it says the brother of Jesus further on it. And it looked, when I look at it, it seems like it all looks the same to me. But somebody else, when they looked at it, they said, no, somebody did that at a later date. It still looks ancient, but still you have the people that are skeptics and you have the people that believe. In this case, even if it doesn't say the brother of Jesus, that's still pretty awesome that we would have the remains of James, the brother of Jesus. A couple other things. You know, you've heard of the straight street that in Damascus. That's biblical. Have you ever heard of that? Well, thanks to Alexander the Great, everything he conquered had to have north-south streets and east-west streets. And I'm not sure if it's the north street or the east or west, but it's called the straight street. And then where they all connect, you have this big old marketplace. Anyway, this is Damascus. This is straight street if you look one direction, and that's straight street if you look the other direction. So Rome did the roads, and right down the center you can see that's where the sewer went. That's pretty amazing. And notice how big it is. You know, sometimes, at least in my mind, I think when Jesus lived, you know, it was a little village, and, you know, there wasn't a lot of people. There were a lot of people. They needed big streets for their chariots and all the other things that were going on. So the marketplace, we hear about the marketplace too. Here's a cool picture of it. It's big. This is where they sold the slaves. This is where people were healed. This is where they preached. This was the center of town. This is where all the activity took place. Anyway, I think this is pretty exciting in that what we see out on the landscape, the archaeology supports the biblical picture that we have. A couple other really quick things. You may have heard of a varve. I know that's not a little critter. A varve are lake sediments. And in the literature you hear some people say, well, the varves, there were 30,000 varve layers, and so it must have been 30,000 years, like tree rings. And that's not true. You do get to see the white and the black and the white and the black, but those could be just sequences. It could have been some water with some sediment flushed in, and then it's calm for a few days, and then another one comes in, and it keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. So again, geologists make a big deal of this. They say that certain lake sediments are, 30,000 years or 40,000 years, and it's because they counted 30 or 40,000 of these layers. But it could have been 30 or 40,000 little precipitation events. We don't know. There it is in the core. I do believe in tree dating, or at least close. Some trees don't give you a ring every year. If it's really dry, you won't see one. And I'll bet that if you have some strange seasons where it's wet, dry, you might get more than one. But for the most part, They're pretty good. This tree is actually in Mexico. It's got an interesting name. El Arbo del Tule, the tree of Tule. And they only have been able to estimate its age. And they think it's about 3,000 years. So that's pretty big. Can you imagine putting a core all the way through? I don't know how they do it. Now this one is Methuselah. Now we have a tree in my office area that's about 2,000 years old. They won't tell us which one it is, and we just had a fire that burned through this, this forest, and they hope that the old one is still there. In fact, they won't even show you. In fact, this is probably not even the one. So back in the early 1900s, they found one. This is in California. I know there's some in Nevada and there's some in Utah that are pretty close to this. But this is like Methuselah. They won't let people know where it is because they don't want it damaged. But this one has been plugged, and according to last year, no, it's been updated some. It's over 4,789 years old. This is the oldest tree in the world that we know of. Now, sometimes you'll see reports that there's a 10,000-year tree and some other things like that, but that's not the tree. They're looking at different methods of dating not only the tree, but a dead tree next to it, thinking that they'd add to it. Anyway, I think that's pretty exciting. 5,000 years, that kind of works pretty good into my time frame. That flood, or at least after the flood. That worked. I'm going to skip the Vostok ice drillings. They're very similar to the Varves. They did this in, actually they've done it in Greenland, but this one was done in Antarctica. And it's about 10,000 feet worth of ice cores that they drilled through. And they think that they can determine the environment for all those years and use CO2 and tell you how many times, the earth is warmed and cooled. And catch me at lunch and I'll talk about those. And I want to finish up with this story. Like my colleagues, my friends, I think even though there's a lot of evidence out there, they don't want to know. They just don't want to know. I don't know if you've seen the movie A Case for Christ. Anybody seen that? A man named Strobel was he's almost an investigator on it, but he's a journalist. And there was a cop shooting. And supposedly this guy here, Mr. Hicks, shot the policeman. So he was a gang member, and it looked really bad. Earlier in the day, or earlier in that night, he had a gun, same caliber. He shot it. He was mad at his wife, and he shot it at the building. And so it had, one shot missing. And then when he sees the cop, it's like, oh, get rid of the gun. And he throws it away and puts it in the bush. Problem is, in the scuffle between him and his friend, because he'd been arrested by this guy like a lot of times, they were on a first-name basis, a gun went off and the policeman was shot. And it's like, well, what happened? Well, everybody thought that Hicks was the one that did it. Lee Strobel, the journalist, kind of investigated a little bit, interviewed both of them, and he just thought that this guy was just guilty. And he wrote a piece that was published even before the court case, making it look like he had shot his hand, or that he was a drug dealer, and for whatever reason he was a snitch and shot the cop. Come to find out, so he goes to jail, and while he's in jail, he shot a cop, so nobody's going to like him for that. And then He's been reported to be a gang member who was snitching on the gang, and so those guys weren't liking him either. And anyway, he just gets beat to a pulp. Just beat up. So bad that he has to go to the hospital. In the meantime, Strobel finds out he was wrong, that it was actually a pen that had gone off. He had a pen gun in his breast pocket. That's what killed him, or shot him. And he knew he was wrong. So he went to Mr. Hicks in the hospital, and he tried to apologize and said, I didn't see it. I'm sorry, I just didn't see it. And Hicks said something very profound. He said, you didn't want to see it. You didn't want to see it. And I think that's the case with a lot of my atheist friends, some scientists that I work with, and you might have some people that you might know of. They don't want to know it in a lot of cases. And in that case, I hope, I pray, but I know that if they don't change their mind, if they never turn to Christ, that someday they're going to hear Jesus say the same thing, that there's nothing I can do for you, that I'm going to have to, how can I give you up? How can I let you go? Just like that he did in Amos and Hosea. So, a little summary. I hope you take a little time to look into Anthony Flew, Francis Collins, and some of the other folks that are modern day science heroes who also love the Lord. And remember that the present is not the key to the past. And happy Sabbath.